In the early spring of 1944, a pilot assigned to the esteemed 56th Fighter Group, soaring high above the German countryside in his P-47 Thunderbolt, had just completed the arduous task of escorting a formidable bomber formation deep into enemy territory. With the primary mission accomplished, the opportunity arose to engage in opportunistic strikes on the return journey. Below, a sprawling Luftwaffe airfield presented itself, its runways neatly bisected by rows of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, seemingly dormant and vulnerable. As the flight leader issued the command to attack, the pilot initiated his dive, aligning his formidable aircraft with the runway from the east, a maneuver ingrained by countless training exercises, conducted meticulously back in England. This was the prescribed logical approach, one perfected over months of rigorous preparation. However, the seemingly routine attack rapidly devolved into a maelstrom of chaos. The serene sky exploded with a sudden, terrifying ferocity, as bright tracer rounds arced upwards from every conceivable angle across the airfield. The anti-aircraft fire, known colloquially as flak, was so incredibly dense it felt almost tangible. In an instant, a devastating direct hit to his wingman's engine sent the companion aircraft spiraling away, leaving a stark trail of thick black smoke against the pale sky. Committed to the attack, the pilot plunged onward, screaming towards the ground at an incredible 300 miles per hour, acutely aware that every single gun emplacement on that enemy field had anticipated his precise trajectory. They had been lying in wait. He managed to strafe the stationary aircraft, witnessing the metallic glint of his rounds striking a Bf-109. But his own Thunderbolt was simultaneously absorbing dozens of punishing blows. The robust airframe shuddered violently as 20mm shells ripped through his wing. Driven by sheer adrenaline, which momentarily numbed the shock of the damage, he executed a desperate hard pull-up, somehow managing to nurse his battered fighter across the vast expanse of the English Channel and back to safety. This harrowing experience was far from an isolated catastrophe. It was, in fact, an all too common and brutal reality for American fighter pilots throughout the latter part of 1943 and the early months of 1944. Missions specifically designed to strafe or attack enemy aircraft on the ground had tragically transformed into veritable suicide runs, incurring casualty rates so alarmingly high that even the hardened bomber crews, accustomed to their own perilous missions, recoiled in disbelief. The fundamental issue was not a deficiency in the pilots' unwavering courage or their exceptional flying skills. Rather, the insidious problem lay in the sheer predictability of their attack methods. American aviators were rigidly adhering to textbook attack patterns, which the astute Luftwaffe command had, with devastating effectiveness, long since deciphered and exploited. We kindly invite you to remain with us and view the entirety of this video. Your support, signified by a like and subscription, would be deeply appreciated. Please also consider sharing your geographical origin in the comments section below, along with your thoughts on the subject matter discussed. Every enemy airfield situated across occupied Europe had been meticulously designed with the prevailing westerly winds in mind, dictating that aircraft would typically take off and land heading eastward directly into the wind. Consequently, American pilots, following this logical operational imperative, invariably initiated their attacks from the east as well. This approach offered them the most advantageous and elongated strafing run directly down the runway, maximizing their time on target. However, the Luftwaffe was far from naive. German anti-aircraft crews, with chilling foresight, strategically positioned their formidable guns precisely where they would inflict the most devastating damage, concentrating their firepower overwhelmingly on these predictable eastern approaches. Each 20mm quad mount, every formidable 3.7cm flak gun, and every concealed machine gun nest was meticulously sighted in, pre-calibrated for this anticipated avenue of attack. When American fighters came screaming in from the east, they were, in essence, flying directly into a pre-registered kill zone, where German gunners had already computed the precise range, deflection, and firing solutions required. It was akin to deliberately entering a lethal meat grinder that had been specifically engineered to annihilate American fighters. The horrific loss rates unequivocally underscored this brutal truth. During the strafing operations conducted in January and February of 1944, 8th Fighter Command experienced a catastrophic rate of aircraft loss, nearly 4 times higher than that sustained in intense air-to-air combat engagements. Pilots who had valiantly survived months of grueling dogfighting against the Luftwaffe's most skilled aces were now being shot down by ground gunners who never even caught a glimpse of their faces. It became glaringly apparent that a fundamental change was not merely desirable, but absolutely imperative, and it needed to be implemented with extreme urgency. The monumental invasion of Europe was looming on the horizon, and the Allied forces required unequivocal air superiority, not solely in the vast expanse of the sky, but critically, on the ground as well. The Luftwaffe had dedicated years to meticulously refining and perfecting its airfield defense strategies, elevating them to an exact science. This was no hastily assembled collection of a few machine guns haphazardly scattered around a perimeter. German engineers had, through painstaking design and construction, transformed every operational airfield across occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands into deeply layered fortresses. These intricate defensive networks created overlapping fields of fire that rendered penetration virtually impossible, without incurring catastrophic damage. A walk around a typical Luftwaffe airfield in early 1944 would reveal a staggering density of between 40 and 80 distinct anti-aircraft positions, each strategically placed. The Germans brilliantly implemented a defense-in-depth concept, a doctrine skillfully borrowed from their highly effective ground warfare strategies. The outermost defensive ring, typically situated approximately 800 to 1,000 meters from the runway, was equipped with lighter yet highly effective 20mm or Flak 38 guns, the very same weapons that had so effectively decimated RAF bombers during the Battle of Britain. These rapid-firing guns could unleash an astonishing 120 rounds per minute, and were specifically positioned to engage attacking aircraft during their initial approach run, aiming to disrupt their trajectory before they could even properly line up for a strafing pass. Closer in, at distances ranging from 400 to 600 meters, lay the intermediate defensive layer. This zone featured the more formidable 37mm and 40mm guns, which delivered significantly heavier shells, often equipped with devastating proximity fuses. These were the true killers. A single well-aimed 37mm round possessed enough destructive power to tear the wing clean off a P-47 Thunderbolt or snap the tail section entirely from a P-51 Mustang. German crews underwent continuous, rigorous training in tracking fast-moving aerial targets, and their proficiency was unnervingly high. Survivors of these harrowing strafing runs frequently recounted seeing these medium-caliber guns tracking their aircraft with terrifying, almost prescient precision, their barrels swiveling relentlessly to follow their flight path as they plunged into the attack. The innermost ring, perhaps the most perilous of all, comprised quad-mounted 20mm guns positioned directly alongside the runway approaches. These formidable weapons could collectively pump out nearly 500 rounds per minute per mount. At distances under 300 meters, these weapons did not even require exceptional accuracy. They simply saturated the sky with such an overwhelming volume of metal that any aircraft attempting to fly through their concentrated fire cone was, statistically speaking, irrevocably doomed. German gunners grimly referred to this impenetrable wall of lead as the Feuerwand, or firewall. However, the true ingenuity underpinning the Luftwaffe's formidable defensive system extended far beyond the mere presence of the guns themselves. It resided in the meticulous and strategically brilliant manner in which they were positioned, based entirely on operational realities. German airfield commanders possessed an intimate understanding that their own aircraft consistently took off and landed heading east, directly into the prevailing westerly winds. They also intuitively knew that attacking Allied fighters would inevitably follow this identical approach vector in order to maximize their precious time on target. Consequently, they deliberately concentrated and stacked their defensive firepower along the eastern approaches, creating an impenetrable fortress wall of anti-aircraft fire. Every single gun position had pre-calculated firing solutions meticulously prepared for targets approaching from specific compass headings. German gunners were not required to guess or estimate. They had practiced firing rounds at those exact angles hundreds, if not thousands, of times, ensuring deadly efficiency. Adding another layer of cunning to their defenses, the Germans even strategically positioned dummy aircraft on the western side of their airfields, serving as tempting bait. These decoys were typically either shot-up wrecks or cleverly constructed wooden mock-ups, meticulously painted to convincingly resemble fully operational fighters. The underlying strategic thinking was elegantly simple. If an American pilot, against all odds, chose to approach from the west, he would inevitably waste his precious ammunition on these worthless targets, while simultaneously flying through comparatively lighter defenses. Subsequently, he would then be forced to break off his attack and run directly into the concentrated eastern flak belt during his escape, sealing his fate. Intelligence reports gleaned from captured Luftwaffe personnel unequivocally confirmed that German airfield defense crews had explicit orders: engage targets at maximum range when they approached from the east, force them to traverse multiple overlapping fire zones, and crucially, maintain concentrated fire even after the attacking aircraft had passed overhead, specifically to inflict damage during their egress. The official manual utilized by German anti-aircraft units explicitly noted that enemy fighter bombers will approach from the landing direction, and meticulously positioned their forces accordingly. American pilots were not merely confronting guns, they were facing a deeply ingrained defensive philosophy that had, with chilling accuracy, predicted their every move. Colonel Hubert Zemke was not the type of commanding officer who passively accepted avoidable casualties as an unfortunate but necessary cost of doing business. As the esteemed commander of the 56th Fighter Group, famously known as the Wolf Pack, He had painstakingly forged a formidable reputation built upon a unique blend of aggressive tactical innovation, coupled with an analytical rigor that was remarkably uncommon among the typically audacious fighter pilots of his era. While many other group commanders focused almost exclusively on fostering individual bravery and refining flying prowess, Zemke approached the complex challenges of air combat with the meticulous mindset of an engineer striving to solve a multifaceted problem. And in the early months of 1944, he confronted a profoundly distressing problem that was systematically decimating his highly skilled pilots at an absolutely unacceptable rate. Driven by an urgent need for understanding and change, Zemke embarked on a rigorous data collection initiative. Following every single strafing mission, he personally conducted detailed debriefings with the surviving pilots, meticulously mapping out the exact locations where their aircraft had sustained damage, identifying precisely which gun positions had initially engaged them, and recording their precise approach vectors. He also proactively requested high-resolution reconnaissance photographs of Luftwaffe airfields, spending countless hours poring over them with his intelligence officer, diligently marking every discernible flak position with a grease pencil. What gradually emerged from this exhaustive analysis was a discernible pattern so strikingly obvious that it seemed almost incredible that no one had recognized or acted upon it previously. The Luftwaffe had overwhelmingly constructed their formidable defenses with attacks from the east exclusively in mind. The Western approaches, by stark contrast, possessed perhaps only 1/3 of the gun emplacements, and those few that did exist were primarily positioned to engage aircraft climbing out after an attack run, rather than those incoming for an initial pass. More importantly, the most lethal 37 and 40 millimeter guns, responsible for the most devastating damage, were all meticulously sighted in with pre-calculated firing solutions specifically for eastward approaches. Zemke's meticulous analysis led him to a truly pivotal realization. He understood that these heavy anti-aircraft guns, despite their destructive power, could not easily traverse rapidly enough to effectively engage targets approaching from unexpected angles. Anti-aircraft guns in 1944 were not the sophisticated point-and-shoot weapons of later eras. Engaging a fighter aircraft traveling at an astonishing 300 miles per hour required the gun crew to swiftly and accurately calculate lead, elevation, and deflection. The Germans had painstakingly performed all of this complex mathematical computation in advance, but only for eastward approaches. A target approaching from the west, however, attacking in the complete opposite direction of normal landing patterns, would necessitate the gunners to entirely reverse their pre-calculated firing solutions in the fleeting handful of seconds between visual acquisition and the aircraft entering weapons range. It was the crucial difference between aiming at a target one had practiced hitting 1,000 times and attempting to shoot at something unexpectedly coming from directly behind you. Armed with this profound insight, Zemke proposed a truly radical and audacious strategy, attacking Luftwaffe airfields from the west, deliberately flying against the normal traffic pattern and strafing in the opposite direction of takeoffs and landings. His staff initially thought he had lost his mind. The prevailing conventional wisdom dictated that one always attacked along the runway axis to maximize time on target. And runways, due to prevailing winds, invariably ran east-west. Attacking from the west, they argued, would mean strafing across the runway instead of down its entire length, thereby affording less time to engage the parked aircraft. However, Zemke had meticulously crunched the numbers. He reasoned that if attacking from the west meant his pilots would incur a staggering 70% less flak damage, they could readily afford a slightly reduced time on target. Dead pilots, he pragmatically understood, could not destroy enemy aircraft. Live pilots who survived their initial pass could always come around for a second. The crucial kill-to-loss ratio, he predicted, would improve dramatically, even if the effectiveness of individual passes decreased marginally. Colonel Zemke was not interested in theoretical perfect attacks. He was relentlessly focused on implementing attacks that his men would survive. The innovative tactical approach, christened reverse pattern strafing, promised to significantly enhance the survivability of his airmen. Diverging sharply from the conventional approach vectors that German air defenses had meticulously optimized for, American fighter squadrons would execute a low-level ingress from the west. This unconventional maneuver was designed to exploit the crucial element of surprise, enabling them to strike parked enemy aircraft before the flak crews could mount an effective response. Following their assault, the American fighters would then swiftly egress eastward, rapidly ascending through what had traditionally served as the approach corridor for attacking forces. By the time the disoriented German gunners managed to reposition their heavy anti-aircraft weapons and traverse them around, the American fighters would already be accelerating away at treetop level, a dangerously low altitude where the formidable flak guns possessed insufficient depression capabilities to effectively track them. For Zemke, proving the efficacy of this audacious strategy was paramount, necessitating a rigorous combat test under authentic conditions against a heavily fortified objective. A pivotal date in this unfolding narrative was May 8, 1944. The designated target for this crucial experiment was Oschersleben, a significant Luftwaffe airfield situated approximately 80 miles to the west of Berlin. Intelligence reports indicated that this installation served as the home base for elements of Jagdgeschwader 11, recognized as one of the Luftwaffe's most elite fighter units. In the preceding months, the airfield had endured numerous assaults employing conventional eastward approaches. These earlier raids had inflicted a toll of 11 lost fighters upon 8th Fighter Command, while achieving the destruction of perhaps twice that number of German aircraft on the ground. This exchange rate was deemed unacceptably high, prompting Zemke's 56th Fighter Group to embark upon a distinctly different and daring course of action. The mission briefing conducted on that fateful morning represented a dramatic departure from established standard operating procedures. Zemke's operations officer meticulously detailed the intricate attack plan. A formation of 16 formidable P-47 Thunderbolts would execute their approach towards Oschersleben from the west, maintaining an absolute minimum altitude. Their low flight path, skillfully masked by the surrounding terrain features, aimed to circumvent early detection by enemy radar systems. They were slated to pop up abruptly, just 2 miles from the airfield, granting the German defenders a mere sliver of time to react. The subsequent strafing run would be directed westward, cutting across the parking revetments and dispersal areas, before the aircraft rapidly egressed to the east. Pilots with prior experience attacking Oschersleben scrutinized the briefing maps with palpable skepticism, as their extensive training had invariably emphasized attacking down the runway, not across it. Yet, Zemke had presciently handpicked his flight leaders, seasoned commanders who placed implicit trust in his judgment and possessed the invaluable ability to adapt their tactics spontaneously in the heat of combat. Captain Walker Mahurin, already an accomplished ace with 16 confirmed aerial victories, was designated to spearhead the initial flight. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, renowned for his heroic feat of nursing a severely damaged Thunderbolt back from a mission after enduring over 200 hits, would command the second flight. These were not inexperienced pilots prone to panic when confronted with unforeseen circumstances. Rather, they were hardened combat veterans. Indeed, open fire. But their numbers were sparse, and their crews were engaged in a frantic, futile attempt to track targets that had already swept past their optimal firing positions. Captain Mahurin's flight unleashed a torrent of fire upon the primary dispersal area, where numerous FW-190s were meticulously parked, wingtip to wingtip. His 850 caliber machine guns, 4 embedded within each wing, fired in one continuous, devastating burst that annihilated 3 enemy fighters before he even found it necessary to adjust his aim. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds, designed for maximum destructive effect, tore through the aluminum skins, ruptured fuel tanks, and shattered the engine blocks of the Focke-Wulfs with catastrophic efficiency. 2 of these formidable German aircraft exploded instantaneously, while the third simply crumpled inward as its internal structural integrity completely failed. Concurrently, Lieutenant Johnson's flight concentrated its lethal attention on the northern revetments, where Bf-109s sat ensconced within sandbagged protective positions. The critical advantage afforded by the reverse approach meant that these defensive emplacements were being struck from their rear quarters, precisely the areas where the Germans had neglected to reinforce them. The formidable sandbag walls, specifically designed to shield the fighters from frontal assaults, were rendered utterly ineffective against the relentless fire that now originated from directly behind them. Johnson, with remarkable precision and devastating effect, personally destroyed 4 Messerschmitts in a single, intense 5-second burst. Amidst this relentless assault, the German flak crews were plunged into utter disarray and chaos. The heavy 37 mm guns stationed on the eastern side of the airfield had been strategically positioned and optimized to engage incoming aircraft approaching from that direction, not to contend with aircraft that were already directly overhead and rapidly receding. By the time the frantic gunners managed to traverse their heavy weapons around, the Thunderbolts were already in the process of egressing eastward at their maximum speed and minimum possible altitude. A few sporadic bursts of light flak trailed after them, but the concentrated, devastating barrage of fire that had invariably characterized previous attacks on the airfield never materialized. It became glaringly apparent that the German defensive firewall possessed a fatal, exploitable gap, and Zemke's exceptionally skilled pilots had flown straight through it with impunity. The astonishing results of this mission left 8th Fighter Command utterly stunned. The 56th Fighter Group had successfully destroyed an impressive 23 German aircraft on the ground at Oschersleben, a figure more than double the typical haul achieved in previous conventional raids. Even more significantly, all 16 of the attacking Thunderbolts returned safely to their base. While a few sustained minor damage from flak, none of it was serious. there were 0 losses. This outcome, a complete absence of casualties for a strafing mission against such a heavily defended target, was truly unprecedented and unheard of in the annals of aerial warfare. The profound success achieved at Oschersleben extended far beyond merely surprising the German defenders on a single occasion. Semke and his astute intelligence staff quickly recognized that they had exposed a fundamental and deeply ingrained weakness within the Luftwaffe's entire airfield defense doctrine, a systemic flaw that could not be easily rectified. This critical vulnerability, they deduced, was intrinsically rooted in the immutable laws of physics, the inherent limitations of engineering design, and the complex operational realities governing the actual functioning of airfields. To truly comprehend why these reverse pattern attacks proved so devastatingly effective, one must meticulously examine the critical 15-second window that elapsed from the moment American fighters first appeared over the horizon. German flak guns were by no means autonomous systems. Rather, their operation demanded the intricate dance and meticulous synchronization of a crew comprising 4 to 6 men. This coordinated effort included a commander vocally relaying target bearings, loaders diligently feeding ammunition into the breech, gunners precisely traversing the weapon and adjusting its elevation, and spotters diligently tracking the target's movement. The heavy 37 and 40 mm guns, which typically inflicted the most substantial damage upon attacking aircraft, possessed traverse rates of approximately 20 to 30 degrees per second. While this speed was generally sufficient to track a target moving across their field of view at a predictable angle, it proved utterly inadequate for swinging the weapon completely around when an enemy aircraft suddenly appeared from the exact opposite, unforeseen direction. In the scenario of a conventional engagement, when American fighters launched their attacks from the east, German gun crews were afforded a crucial window of between 12 and 18 seconds from the initial visual acquisition of the target to the moment it entered effective weapons range. In such instances, the guns were invariably prepositioned and already pointed in the general direction of the anticipated threat. Gunners then made only minor, fine-tuning adjustments. Loaders stood ready with ammunition at hand, and commanders had pre-calculated firing solutions deeply ingrained in their memory. This predictable situation was akin to a baseball player standing confidently at the plate, fully anticipating a pitch whose trajectory and speed he largely knew. All the necessary preparation had been meticulously completed, and the subsequent execution was simply a matter of precise timing. Reverse pattern attacks, however, dramatically inverted this entire defensive equation. When fighters approached from the west, gun crews were compelled to physically rotate their formidable weapons through an arduous 180-degree arc, a half-circle traverse that, for the heavy flak guns, consumed a significant 6 to 9 seconds. Crucially, the American fighters were only 12 seconds away from being directly overhead. Consequently, by the time German gunners managed to get their weapons pointed in the correct direction, the P-47s were already actively strafing parked aircraft and commencing their rapid egress. The window for effective engagement, which had previously been a comfortable 15 seconds, was now severely truncated, collapsing to perhaps a mere 3 or 4 seconds of viable firing time. Exacerbating the predicament for the beleaguered defenders, the egress route adopted by the American fighters led them directly through what had traditionally been the primary approach corridor, the eastern sector where the heaviest flak guns were strategically positioned. However, these fighters were now moving rapidly away at high speed and maintaining an extremely low altitude. Flak guns, by their very design, possess inherent physical limitations concerning depression. They are simply incapable of aiming straight down. Most heavy German anti-aircraft weapons could not depress below -3 degrees, which effectively meant that once an aircraft dropped below a certain critically low altitude relative to the gun position, it became physically impossible to hit it. American pilots, expertly exploiting the advantages of reverse pattern attacks, egressed at altitudes ranging from 50 to 100 feet off the ground, placing them well below the depression limits of the most dangerous German weapons and effectively rendering them inert. The intricate mathematics of deflection shooting further compounded the challenge for German gunners. When a target traverses one's field of view, the fundamental principle dictates that one must aim ahead of it, leading the target so that one's shells and the aircraft converge at the same precise point in space. The precise amount of lead required is contingent upon the target's speed and its angle of approach. German gunners had practiced these complex calculations endlessly for targets approaching from the east, developing deeply ingrained reflexes. Yet, when fighters suddenly materialized from the west, all those familiar calculations were perilously inverted. A gunner who had trained for months to lead targets moving from left to right was abruptly forced to recalculate for right-to-left movement under intense combat stress, with only a few precious seconds to execute the adjustment. In this critical moment, muscle memory, usually an asset, became a significant liability. Gunners instinctively led targets in the wrong direction, inadvertently sending their shells trailing behind the American fighters instead of accurately in front of them. Captured German documents from June 1944 unequivocally corroborated the severity and extent of this newly identified problem. Luftwaffe airfield defense units formally reported significant difficulties in effectively engaging enemy fighters attacking from these non-standard vectors and urgently requested the repositioning of their heavy flak batteries. However, this is where the harsh realities of operational logistics created an insurmountable dilemma. The guns could not simply be moved at will. Their existing positions had been meticulously selected and established over years of defensive doctrine, intricately tied into vital communications networks, supplied by ammunition dumps, strategically positioned for specific sectors, and fully integrated into the overall airfield layout. Relocating these entrenched defensive architectures would necessitate weeks of extensive engineering work, time that was critically unavailable during the relentless pace of the ongoing war. The remarkable success achieved by Colonel Zemke quickly became widely known throughout the 8th Fighter Command, spreading with the swiftness of an uncontrolled conflagration. Fighter group commanders, who had been witnessing their pilots sustain heavy casualties during conventional strafing runs, suddenly possessed an efficacious tactical strategy that yielded tangible results. By the latter part of May 1944, merely weeks prior to the pivotal D-Day landings, the innovative reverse pattern concept was being presented and discussed at both wing and higher command echelons. Major General William Kepner, then at the helm of the 8th Fighter Command, immediately recognized its immense potential as a force multiplier, capable of fundamentally altering the dynamics of the air superiority campaign unfolding over occupied European territories. The formal endorsement and implementation of this new doctrine transpired with a speed almost unparalleled in the annals of military tactical innovation. On May 22, 1944, the 8th Fighter Command officially promulgated Tactical Directive 244, which unequivocally authorized reverse pattern strafing attacks against Luftwaffe airfields and strongly advocated that group commanders integrate this groundbreaking technique into their standard operational procedures. While the directive did not mandate its exclusive application, acknowledging that conventional attacks still held relevance depending on the target, specific configuration, and the enemy's defensive setup, it nonetheless provided official sanction to what had originated as Zemke's experimental and unorthodox method. Merely a fortnight before this official directive, training cycles had dramatically intensified across the 30 fighter groups strategically stationed throughout England. Pilots who, for many months, had diligently practiced strafing runs, utilizing a single, conventional approach, were now compelled to fundamentally reorient their methodology entirely. Extensive practice missions conducted over various Royal Air Force training fields unequivocally demonstrated that while the learning curve presented significant challenges, it ultimately proved surmountable. The most arduous aspect was not the inherent difficulty of the flying itself, rather, it was the demanding process of supplanting the deeply ingrained instinct to attack along the predictable runway axis. Seasoned aviators consistently found themselves instinctively wanting to align their approach with the longest dimension of the target. Squadron commanders were therefore tasked with forcefully impressing upon their crews the critical understanding that operational efficacy and pilot preservation unequivocally superseded conventional textbook tactical geometry. The profound benefits of this revised strategy manifested with striking rapidity. Between May 21st and June 5th, 1944, a crucial 2-week period immediately preceding the monumental Normandy invasion, the 8th Fighter Command executed a total of 63 strafing missions targeting Luftwaffe airfields situated across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. A substantial 47 of these missions explicitly utilized the newly adopted reverse pattern attacks. The comparative statistics were compelling. The loss rate experienced by American forces precipitously declined from 8.3% per mission when employing conventional approaches to a mere 2.1% when utilizing the reverse pattern tactics. Even more significantly, the rate of destruction inflicted upon German aircraft on the ground almost precisely doubled, escalating from an average of 1.4 aircraft obliterated per attacking fighter to an impressive 2.6 aircraft annihilated per attacking fighter. The mathematical evidence was incontrovertible. For every American fighter unfortunately lost, the Luftwaffe was suffering the destruction of a substantially greater quantity of its own aircraft on the ground compared to the figures recorded in preceding months. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video for more compelling insights. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also share a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Major Thomas Hayes, a distinguished aviator from the 357th Fighter Group, was credited with the destruction of 6 Bf-109s in a single audacious reverse pattern pass against Juvincourt Airfield on June 3rd, subsequently executing a second pass that secured the elimination of an additional trio. His flight of 4 P-51 Mustangs collectively accounted for the obliteration of 27 German aircraft on that pivotal day, remarkably achieving this feat without a single loss to their own formation. Such prodigious numbers would have been utterly unattainable using conventional tactics. The 9th Air Force, primarily entrusted with providing tactical air support for ground forces, assimilated this innovative methodology with even greater alacrity than the 8th. Their P-47 and P-38 units were already habitually engaged at reduced flight levels and possessed more extensive operational experience with ground attack missions, making the transition smoother. When the reverse pattern doctrine began to disseminate throughout tactical fighter-bomber squadrons in early June, pilots who had previously been apprehensive about undertaking airfield strikes suddenly and eagerly put themselves forward for such assignments. The 362nd Fighter Group, for instance, conducted 31 reverse pattern attacks between June 6th and June 30th, annihilating in excess of 200 German aircraft on airfields scattered across Normandy, while suffering the loss of only 4 P-47s to enemy ground fire. Intelligence assessments derived from ultra-intercepts, the highly secretive decryptions of German communications, unequivocally indicated that Luftwaffe units were frantically appealing for reinforced airfield defenses and reporting profound declines in troop spirit among ground crews who perceived themselves as utterly vulnerable against the new American tactics. One particularly telling intercepted message, originating from Luftwaffe 3 headquarters in mid-June, lamented that enemy fighters now attacking from all vectors, defensive preparations insufficient, urgent need for mobile flak batteries. The Luftwaffe was acutely aware of the unfolding tactical shift. They simply possessed no viable means to arrest its devastating progression. By July 1944, reverse pattern strafing had become entrenched as standard tactical dogma across both the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Training manuals underwent comprehensive revision, and gun camera footage depicting successful attacks was widely disseminated for pedagogical purposes. Furthermore, new pilots arriving in the theater were rigorously indoctrinated in the methodology before embarking on their inaugural combat mission. What had commenced as one colonel's incisive strategic insight into a pressing tactical problem had, in less than 2 months, been thoroughly codified as standard operating procedure and institutionalized across the entirety of the American fighter force operating in Europe. The Luftwaffe, however, was not passively observing while American fighters systematically devastated their aerial infrastructure. German commanders instantly apprehended the gravity of the peril and immediately commenced initiating responsive defensive measures as swiftly as wartime logistics would permit. The inherent problem was that every conceivable solution invariably encountered insuperable limitations, crippling resource shortages, unrelenting time pressure, and the fundamental physics governing airfield defense. The Americans had uncovered a vulnerability in the enemy's protective layer, and it became starkly apparent that this vulnerability was, in fact, an inherent systemic vulnerability within the very structure of German airfield defenses. The initial German countermeasure was a predictable and logical reaction, the strategic repositioning of anti-aircraft artillery to specifically cover Western approaches. In the latter part of May and early June 1944, Luftwaffe airfield defense units received explicit directives to reallocate their anti-aircraft weapons into more symmetrically arrayed defensive configurations. Heavy 37mm and 40mm guns which had previously been concentrated on eastern sectors, were to be moved to establish mutually reinforcing arcs of anti-aircraft engagement from all compass directions. Conceptually, it presented a sound strategy. In practical application, however, it quickly devolved into an operational quagmire. The undertaking of relocating a heavy flak position was a considerably more arduous undertaking than repositioning a mere machine gun nest. Each 30-cm flak 43, complete with its formidable mount, weighed in excess of $4,000 lbs and necessitated either a robust subterranean concrete base or heavily reinforced earthworks to absorb the immense kinetic energy generated by firing. Furthermore, the intricate electrical targeting systems, secure ammunition storage bunkers, vital communications lines, and essential crew shelters all had to be entirely reconstructed anew. Engineering units projected a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks per position to properly relocate and meticulously re-zero the weapons. The Luftwaffe, tragically, were critically devoid of the requisite time frame. The Allied invasion was already underway, and American fighters were relentlessly assailing airfields on a daily basis. In response to these constraints, some airfield commanders resorted to provisional remedies, deploying guns on makeshift emplacements without proper foundations. These improvised installations, however, suffered from profound operational drawbacks. Lacking stable platforms, the accuracy of their fire was markedly compromised. The immense recoil generated from rapid firing would inevitably shift the entire gun position, thereby disrupting the aiming trajectory. Crews frequently reported experiencing jamming issues and mechanical failures attributable to the incessant vibrations. A hastily emplaced flak gun might manage to discharge a few bursts, but it simply could not deliver the focused and precise barrages that had originally rendered German airfield defenses so lethal. The Luftwaffe also endeavored to employ stratagems of misdirection, deploying highly maneuverable anti-aircraft units in the form of truck-mounted 20mm guns, which possessed the capability to rapidly redeploy in response to changes in attack direction. These mobile flak batteries were identified through aerial surveillance imagery by mid-June, typically positioned on roads encircling airfield perimeters from where they could move to threatened sectors. American pilots, however, rapidly adjusted their tactics within a matter of days. Instead of confining themselves to single-direction attacks, flights began hitting airfields from convergent attack paths from several directions at once. Four-ship flights would bifurcate into dual attack formations, with each element approaching from diametrically opposed approach vectors. This tactic compelled the mobile anti-aircraft units to prioritize a single threat, leaving the other element free to execute their ground attacks unimpeded. The fundamental limitation was inescapable. The mobile guns were inherently incapable of simultaneous engagement across disparate fronts. German engineers advanced a proposal for a comprehensive overhaul of airfield layouts, advocating for the creation of radially arrayed operational configurations where defensive positions would possess equidistant and omnidirectional engagement zones. Luftwaffe headquarters actually formally sanctioned this strategic initiative in July 1944 and designated the necessary materiel and manpower to rebuild 6 major airfields in France, according to these new specifications. However, a mere 3 weeks later, all 6 of these airfields were already in Allied hands, following the dramatic Normandy breakout. Consequently, these ambitious defensive redesigns remained purely theoretical constructs, never progressing beyond the blueprint stage. The Luftwaffe also attempted to employ deception tactics. They created ersatz anti-aircraft installations on western approaches, comprising fortified positions constructed from sandbags, featuring logs artfully camouflaged to simulate artillery pieces. Their hope was that American aviators would shun these sectors or expend valuable operational time circumventing illusory dangers. Ultra-intercepts, however, exposed this ploy in early July, prompting the 8th Fighter Command to simply direct their air crews to disregard suspected dummy positions unless they observed actual muzzle flashes. This deception lasted less than 2 weeks before pilots became proficient in differentiating genuine armaments from their deceptive counterparts. Perhaps the most indicative German response came in late July when several Luftwaffe fighter units unequivocally relinquished forward airfields entirely, withdrawing to more interior operational hubs deeper within Germany, where American fighters possessed reduced endurance for sustained aerial presence during strafing attacks. This was not merely a tactical adjustment, it constituted an unambiguous acknowledgement of their inability to contend. By retreating eastward, the Luftwaffe voluntarily sacrificed operational flexibility and vital response time, thereby relinquishing dominance of the aerial domain over the battlefield in a desperate attempt to safeguard their dwindling aerial assets. Allied intelligence observed that some German fighter groups were flying combat missions from airfields situated over 200 miles from the front lines, expending invaluable aviation fuel merely to reach the battle area. The fundamental dilemma was that airfields are inherently strategic vulnerabilities. They cannot be concealed, they cannot be readily moved, and they necessitate standardized ingress and egress trajectories dictated by prevailing wind and weather conditions. Once the Americans conclusively proved the efficacy of non-conventional attack vectors, there remained no viable countermeasure that did not involve undertaking a complete reconstruction of their entire defensive apparatus from scratch. The Luftwaffe, besieged on multiple fronts, was critically deficient in the requisite temporal capacity, material assets, or operational latitude to make that happen while fighting a two-front war. The strategic efficacy of the reverse pattern strafing technique did not conclude its relevance with the cessation of hostilities in World War II. The groundbreaking methodology pioneered by Colonel ZMA and his intrepid pilots, first demonstrated with devastating effect over Luftwaffe airfields in 1944, subsequently evolved into a foundational operational doctrine, its principles resonating throughout military aviation to this very day. The central tenet of this innovation, to launch an assault from the direction least anticipated by the adversary, thereby exploiting their inherent operational assumptions, transcended the immediate tactical challenge it was designed to address. Instead, it became an indispensable case study, meticulously analyzed and taught at every preeminent air warfare institution across the globe. In the period immediately following the war's conclusion, the nascent United States Air Force formally integrated reverse pattern attacks into its burgeoning ground attack doctrine. The seminal 1949 manual dedicated to fighter-bomber operations, a crucial guide for aerial combatants, devoted an entire chapter to the strategic deployment of non-standard approach vectors for the critical mission of suppressing enemy air defenses. This codified instruction, while wrapped in the formalistic language of military bureaucracy, was, in essence, a direct bureaucratic articulation of Colonel ZMA's original ingenious concept. Aviators undergoing training for the Korean War assiduously studied gun camera footage from the 1944 strafing runs, viewing these historical records as vital examples of how to survive and succeed within heavily defended airspace. The Korean conflict served to unequivocally prove the enduring relevance of this sophisticated technique, even amidst the dawn of the jet age. When formidable F-80 shooting stars and powerful F-84 Thunderjets began their concerted assaults on North Korean and Chinese airfields in 1951, they encountered defensive networks strikingly similar in their configuration to those previously employed by the Luftwaffe, multi-layered anti-aircraft guns strategically positioned to counter conventional, predictable approach patterns. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. In the comments, please let us know where you are from and what you think about the video topic. American pilots, drawing upon this ingrained institutional knowledge, applied reverse pattern tactics almost instinctively, assailing enemy airfields from unexpected vectors that effectively circumvented and surprised defenders who were primarily configured for traditional predictable assaults. Consequently, the attrition rates for airfield interdiction missions during the Korean War proved substantially lower than the initial projections of strategic planners, a success largely attributable to the seamless transfer of operational wisdom and effective methodologies from the European theater. The tactical efficacy demonstrated by American forces in Korea did not escape the keen observation of the Soviet Union. Following a thorough analysis of American operational tactics, Soviet military aviation strategists undertook a comprehensive overhaul of their established airfield defense doctrine. By the mid-1950s, newly promulgated Soviet air defense manuals unequivocally stipulated the implementation of all-encompassing 360-degree defensive coverage, featuring intricate overlapping fire zones. This directive explicitly identified American variable vector attacks as the primary threat paradigm. Compelling visual evidence emerged in the late 1950s, when American reconnaissance aircraft captured aerial photographs of Soviet airfields, revealing distinctive circular defensive configurations that were immediately discernible as direct strategic adaptations to the very principles Colonel ZMA had originated a mere 15 years prior. The conflict in Vietnam ushered in yet another phase of tactical evolution. By the 1960s, advanced surface-to-air missile systems had largely supplanted traditional anti-aircraft artillery, yet the underlying challenge endured. Adversary forces continued to sight and orient their weaponry based on anticipated attack trajectories. American Wild Weasel missions, executed by highly specialized aircraft dedicated to the critical task of suppressing enemy air defenses, deployed operational methodologies directly traceable to the reverse pattern doctrine. Rather than adhering to the most ostensibly logical approach vectors, Wild Weasel aircrews meticulously executed deliberately erratic flight paths, compelling North Vietnamese missile operators into a ceaseless cycle of repositioning their launchers and recalculating engagement parameters, thereby significantly diminishing their overall operational efficacy. Contemporary stealth technology represents a significant advancement and expansion of this foundational concept. Advanced aircraft, such as the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II, are engineered with radar cross-sections that exhibit substantial variability contingent upon the perspective of the observer. The operational doctrine governing the deployment of these sophisticated platforms prioritizes launching assaults from axes where hostile radar detection capabilities are inherently weakest. This approach is, in essence, a technologically sophisticated manifestation of the original tactic, striking Luftwaffe airfields from the less expected west rather than the anticipated east. Crucially, this principle demonstrates remarkable scalability, proving equally pertinent in close-quarters visual range aerial engagements as it does in complex beyond visual range missile combat scenarios. The Israeli Air Force meticulously examined reverse pattern tactics and subsequently implemented them with devastating effect during the 1967 Six-Day War. On June 5, 1967, Israeli fighter jets executed a series of overwhelming preemptive strikes that effectively neutralized the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. These audacious assaults were launched from an unexpected direction over the Mediterranean Sea, approaching from the north and west. This vector was chosen precisely because Egyptian radar coverage was most attenuated, and defensive emplacements were least concentrated along this maritime approach. Critically, Egyptian airfields had been strategically configured with their primary defenses oriented to counter threats emanating from the east, the geographical direction of Israel. The Israeli forces masterfully capitalized on this fundamental defensive assumption, mirroring the strategic ingenuity Colonel ZMA had demonstrated in exploiting German expectations 23 years prior. Presently, the prestigious United States Air Force Weapons School, situated at Nellis Air Force Base, integrates reverse pattern concepts as a core component of its rigorous suppression of enemy air defenses (CEAD) curriculum. Cadets delve into the historical significance of the Asher's Lean raid, examining it as a compelling illustration of tactical ingenuity forged under the intense crucible of combat. While the specific methodologies have naturally undergone considerable evolution, modern aircraft now leverage sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, deploy advanced standoff weaponry, and benefit from network-centric coordination systems that were entirely non-existent in 1944. The fundamental, immutable principle underpinning these operations endures without alteration. The enduring directive remains starkly simple. Discern your adversary's preconceived notions regarding your probable attack vector, and then execute an entirely divergent course of action. The true marvel of the reverse pattern narrative extends beyond its mere operational success. It resides in the extraordinary achievement of a single officer, Colonel ZMA, who, equipped with nothing more than a calculator and aerial reconnaissance photographs, precisely identified a critical vulnerability, ingeniously devised a countermeasure, rigorously validated it under the harsh realities of active combat, and, in a breathtaking span of under 8 weeks, fundamentally reshaped operational doctrine across an entire theater of war. In a contemporary age where military organizations frequently face scrutiny for their perceived sluggishness in adaptation, Colonel ZMA's groundbreaking innovation stands as compelling evidence that truly effective concepts can propagate with remarkable alacrity when human lives are at stake. The German Luftwaffe had dedicated years to constructing and refining airfield defenses meticulously optimized against a singular, anticipated threat paradigm. In stark contrast, Colonel ZMA required only a matter of weeks to conclusively demonstrate the fundamental flaws within that very model. The profound and far-reaching ramifications of his initial insight remain distinctly perceptible in the strategic and tactical methodologies employed by contemporary air forces when executing ground attack missions. Even 8 decades after its original conception,